The year is 1827. A heavy, gray shroud hangs over the Irish Sea,
thick enough to dampen the sound of the waves against the hull. The Quebec trader drifts in a void where the horizon has simply ceased to exist.
Every rope is slick with moisture. Every plank is cold to the touch.
The wind died hours ago, leaving the ship suspended in a silence so profound it feels heavy against the eardrums.
There is no movement in the rigging. There is no call from the watch.
Just the rhythmic, hollow drip of condensation hitting the deck.
Captain Thomas clearly stands at the helm, his hands gripping the wheel until his knuckles ache. He stares into the white wall of mist, watching for any break in the monotony. He shifts his weight, the wood groaning beneath his boots, a sharp sound that echoes far too loudly in the stillness. He leans forward, squinting into the gloom, waiting for the fog to yield.
He knows the sea does not stay silent without cause. He waits, his breath hitching in the damp.
Frigid air, searching for the first sign of what hides just beyond the reach of his vision. A flicker of movement caught the edge of Clearly's sight. The wall of mist thinned, revealing a jagged silhouette just a few hundred yards off the port bow. It was a bark, drifting aimlessly with its sails hanging in shredded ribbons. Clearly signaled for his first mate, Thomas Wilson. Wilson climbed the ladder, his boots thudding hard against the deck. He followed the direction of the captain's pointing finger. The vessel was a hollow shell, riding low and heavy in the water. No lights flickered on its deck. No flags snapped in the non-existent wind. Clearly raised his glass, scanning the railings and the helm. He saw nothing but rot and stillness. He lowered the glass, his jaw set. This was no wreckage. It was a tomb waiting to be opened. He turned to Wilson,
his voice low but cutting through the silence. "Prepare a boarding party. We need to know what happened here."
Wilson nodded, already turning to summon the men. Clearly watched them scramble, their movements sharp and hurried, as they readied the cutter. The mission was set. They would cross the gap, board the silent ship, and uncover the truth hidden within that drifting, gray-shrouded ruin. 6 men climbed over the side and dropped into the small cutter. Thomas Wilson took the tiller, his grip tight on the wood. The oars hit the surface in unison, a sharp, rhythmic splash that echoed across the water. They pulled away from the Quebec trader,
the larger ship quickly vanishing into the gray veil behind them. The sea was unnervingly smooth, like a sheet of hammered glass.
Every stroke of the oars sent ripples outward, distorting the reflection of the sky in a way that made the surface look fractured.
No fish broke the tension. No current pulled at the keel.
The only sound was the groan of the oarlocks and the steady, heavy breath of the men.
They rowed with purpose, but the silence of the ocean pressed against them, making every movement feel exposed.
As they neared the derelict bark, its size became imposing. It sat motionless,
a dark monolith rising from the mirror-flat sea. Wilson signaled the men to slow. The cutter glided forward, momentum dying as they drifted into the shadow of the rotting hull.
The wood of the ghost ship towered above them, jagged and silent, waiting for them to reach out and touch its side.
The cutter bumped against the barnacle-crusted hull with a hollow, rhythmic thud. Wilson stood,
steadying himself against the motion of the boat, and reached for the rusted iron ladder hanging over the side. He pulled himself up, his boots finding purchase on the slick, rotting wood. He swung his leg over the rail and dropped onto the deck. The ship groaned under his weight, a long, deep vibration that shivered through the planks. He looked around. The deck was littered with debris, ropes coiled like snakes, and shattered glass crunching under his feet.
He signaled for the men below to wait. Wilson moved forward, his hand hovering near his side.
He stepped over a broken spar and reached the center of the deck. The air here felt stagnant, heavy with the smell of salt and old rot. He turned toward the wheel, intending to check the logbook. He took 2 steps, then stopped dead. His muscles locked,
A shadow larger than any man shifted behind the wheel.
It was dense, blocking the faint light from the horizon. It did not move like a person.
It settled, heavy and deliberate, as if waiting for the exact moment he would finally notice it. Wilson did not breathe. The shadow behind the wheel detached itself from the gloom,
unfolding upward with impossible length. A massive, glossy black shape rose, its scales catching the dim light like polished obsidian. It stretched toward the mast, rising 60 feet into the air before arching back down toward the deck. The wood shrieked under the weight of its coils as the creature shifted. Wilson felt the vibration in the soles of his boots, a rhythmic thrumming that rattled his teeth.
The serpent brought its head level with the mate, the movement fluid and terrifyingly precise. It paused, 2 crimson eyes, wide as dinner plates and burning with a cold, ancient hunger, locked onto Wilson. The air grew thick, ionized, and heavy with the scent of brine and musk. Wilson tried to step back, but his legs refused to obey.
The creature did not strike yet. It simply watched, its head swaying slightly, tracking the frantic rise and fall of his chest. It was a predator that knew its prey was already caught.
Every muscle in the serpent's neck corded under the slick, dark skin. It held its position, a towering wall of muscle and malice, while Wilson stood paralyzed, staring into the abyss of those unblinking, blood-red eyes.
The serpent moved faster than thought. The massive head blurred, a dark arc of muscle snapping forward with the force of a falling timber. Wilson screamed, a short, jagged sound, as he threw himself sideways. His hand grazed the rough wood of the railing, but his fingers found no grip. The creature did not miss. Its jaws slammed shut, the sound like a heavy iron gate locking home. Teeth, long and serrated, pierced through the air and closed around the mate's center. The impact knocked the wind out of him instantly. With a violent, serpentine twist, the creature hauled its prize off the deck. Wilson's boots scraped against the planks, leaving deep gouges in the wood before he was hoisted into the air. He spun, arms flailing, but the serpent was already retreating. It pulled him over the stern rail in one fluid, terrifying motion. The men in the cutter watched in absolute silence, oars frozen mid-air, as the black shape vanished into the churning foam. A single, massive ripple spread outward, rocking their small boat violently. Then, the surface went still. Wilson was gone. The only thing left on the deck was the empty space where he had stood seconds before, and the lingering, rhythmic slap of water against the silent ship's hull. The silence shattered. A sailor in the bow dropped his oar, the wood clattering against the gunwale with a sound like a gunshot. He scrambled backward, his boots sliding on the wet floorboards, and kicked the oarsman behind him. Panic surged through the cutter. The remaining 5 men did not wait for orders. They grabbed their oars, blades digging into the glassy surface with frantic, uneven force. Water sprayed over the sides, drenching the men as they pulled against the current. The boat lurched, spinning partially in the water before finding its rhythm. Behind them, the surface of the sea erupted. A massive wake surged toward the cutter, a wall of dark water rising to meet their stern. The men rowed harder, their knuckles white, their breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. One oar snapped under the pressure of a desperate stroke, the wood splintering with a sharp crack that echoed across the mist. The sailor didn't stop. He grabbed the handle and kept pulling with the jagged stump. They were not looking back. They were focused only on the looming hull of the Quebec trader. Every muscle in their backs burned as they drove the boat forward, seeking the safety of their captain's shadow while the ocean churned and hissed in their wake. The cutter slammed against the side of the Quebec trader. Sailors scrambled up the rope netting, their hands trembling as they hauled themselves over the rail. Captain Thomas clearly did not wait for their report. He pointed a steady finger toward the derelict vessel, now drifting closer in the fog. "Aim for the center mass," he commanded. The gun crew moved with practiced, mechanical precision. They swung the heavy iron cannon, adjusted the elevation, and touched the slow match to the touch hole. The deck jumped under the force of the blast. A cloud of acrid white smoke filled the air, obscuring the view for a heartbeat. Then, the sound of splintering wood rang out across the water. The projectile struck the stern of the ghost ship. The impact broke the surface tension of the standoff. The serpent reared up, rising high above the splintered deck. Its throat sac pulsed with a sudden, eerie blue light that cut through the gray mist.
It opened its massive jaws and let out a shrill, piercing shriek that vibrated in the chests of every man on the deck.
The creature did not strike back. It simply slid over the opposite rail and collapsed into the dark water, vanishing without a splash, leaving the sea unnaturally silent once more. The ocean's surface returned to a flat, glassy stillness. The eerie blue glow faded into the gray expanse of the mist,
leaving the men on the Quebec trader in a silence so profound it felt heavy.
Captain clearly paced the deck, his eyes scanning the churned water where the ghost ship continued its aimless drift. The crew stood motionless at the rail, their hands still gripping the cold iron of the cannon,
waiting for a movement that did not come. One by one, the men looked toward the spot where their mate had been pulled down.
The water held no secrets. It offered no sign of a struggle, no wreckage of the boat, only the slow, rhythmic lift and fall of the tide. Then, a small, dark object drifted into the field of vision. It bobbed gently on the crest of a swell, turning slowly in the current.
It was a hat. It drifted alone, caught in a swirling patch of foam, moving further away from the ship with every passing second. No one spoke. The sight of the abandoned object served as a final, hollow confirmation. The sea had claimed its due, and the void it left behind was absolute. The ship felt smaller, the mist colder, and the reality of the loss settled over the deck like a shroud.
44 years passed. The world moved on, but the ocean kept its hunger. It was April 1871. The air off the coast of West Africa hung heavy and motionless, thick with the scent of salt and baking wood. The Danish ship anchor sat dead in the water, a solitary shape against the shimmering horizon. There was no wind to fill the sails, no current to nudge the keel. The heat radiated from the surface of the sea, blurring the distance until the sky and the water became one endless, pale sheet of white. On the deck, the silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic creak of the hull against the swell. The crew moved with the lethargy of men trapped in a kiln, their skins slick with sweat. They did not know that the stillness was a trap. Below the waterline, where the sunlight failed to penetrate, the shadows were deep and shifting. The ship remained perfectly still, a stationary beacon in a vast, empty expanse. The surface looked like glass, but beneath that thin, transparent barrier, something was waiting for the light to fade. The transition from day to evening began, and with it, the slow, inevitable approach of a new terror. Captain John Magnus Dens did not like a dirty hull. He watched from the quarterdeck as the crew prepared for the morning's labor. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the ship and forcing the men to move with deliberate, sluggish precision. He barked an order, and the heavy wooden planks of the cleaning scaffold were swung over the side. 4 sailors climbed down, their boots scraping against the timber as they lowered themselves toward the waterline. They carried scrapers and stiff brushes, their task to clear away the barnacles that clung to the copper sheathing. Dens leaned over the rail, his eyes tracking the work. The water below was unnervingly clear, a deep, crystalline blue that turned to blackness only a few feet beneath the keel. The men worked in rhythm, the metallic rasp of steel against wood echoing across the calm surface. They were exposed, hanging just inches above the depths. their focus entirely on the stubborn growth on the hull. Dens felt a prickle of unease at the back of his neck, but he dismissed it as the toll of the midday sun. Below the surface, the water remained undisturbed, hiding the vast, dark expanse that stretched out beneath the ship. The work continued, oblivious to the silence. The sun dipped below the horizon, stripping the sky of its white glare and replacing it with a bruised, violet light. The heat that had stifled the deck for hours began to bleed away, leaving behind a sharp, sudden chill. The men on the cleaning scaffold paused, their hands stiffening on the handles of their brushes. They looked up, scanning the horizon where the sea and sky began to bleed into a singular, impenetrable dark. Captain Dens stood at the quarterdeck, his fingers tracing the wood of the rail. He watched as the vibrant blue of the water drained away, replaced by a thick, oily blackness. The ocean was no longer clear. It was a dark, unreadable mirror that seemed to pull the light from the air. The movement of the ship slowed even further, as if the water itself were thickening. No birds circled the masts. No fish broke the surface to feed. The silence of the day had been replaced by a heavy, expectant stillness that pressed against the eardrums. The crew hauled the scaffold lines taut, their movements jagged and hurried. They felt the change in the atmosphere, a primal signal that they were no longer alone. The water beneath the keel did not ripple. It held a tension that felt like a coiled spring. The transition was complete. The night had arrived. The men on the scaffold finished their final scrape, the sound of metal on copper ringing out like a bell in the dead air. One sailor wiped his brow, his breath hitching as he looked down into the black water.
He reached for the rope to signal the deck, but his hand froze in midair. The surface,
previously a flat mirror, shattered. A ripple surged outward, faster than any natural tide. Before the crew could shout,
the water erupted. A mass of wet, slick muscle, as thick as a man's torso, breached the surface with a spray of brine and foam. It did not rise slowly. It struck with the speed of a whip. The limb lashed across the scaffold, bypassing the wood entirely to wrap around the two men standing at the center. They had no time to scream. The strength of the coil was absolute, crushing the air from their lungs as they were hauled from their feet.
The scaffold groaned under the sudden, unbalanced weight,
tilting violently as the wood splintered against the hull. The other sailors on the deck lunged for the lines, but the momentum was too great. In a single fluid motion, the tentacle pulled the two men into the dark,
churning depths, leaving only the sound of snapping rope and the slap of water against the ship's side.
The air filled with the frantic shouting of the crew, but the noise failed to drown out the sound of the ocean churning.
A third sailor, seeing his companions vanish, sprinted across the deck toward the rail. He reached out, fingers grasping for the rope trailing from the splintered scaffold. He was inches from the edge when the water surged again. A second limb, darker and more mottled than the first, shot upward from the abyss. It did not strike the ship. It struck the man. The movement was a blur of wet, heavy muscle. The tentacle slammed into the sailor's waist, the impact audible as it knocked the wind from his chest. He clawed at the deck, his boots digging deep furrows into the wood, trying to anchor himself against the overwhelming force. His grip failed. The suction of the limb was relentless, dragging him backward toward the gunwale. He twisted, his hands flailing for a hold, but the surface was slick with brine and slime. He was pulled off his feet, his body lifting into the air as the limb retracted with terrifying speed.
He hit the water with a dull, heavy splash, his desperate shouts cut short as he was hauled down into the blackness.
The water boiled where he disappeared, leaving the remaining crew frozen in the wake of the second strike.
Captain Dens roared over the chaos, his voice cutting through the panic. "To the rail!" Every man with a blade. Now! The command shattered the paralysis. Sailors scrambled, abandoning the rigging to reach the weapon racks.
They returned in seconds, arms heavy with iron-tipped harpoons and steel-headed axes. The deck vibrated as they slammed into the gunwale, staring down at the horror rising from the deep. The two limbs remained coiled against the side of the hull,
pulsing with a rhythmic alien life. A sailor swung his axe, the blade biting deep into the thick,
rubbery tissue. A viscous fluid sprayed across the deck, coating the wood in a slick, dark sheen.
The creature thrashed, the movement violent enough to rattle the ship's timbers. Another man drove a harpoon into the writhing mass,
the iron barb tearing through the tough outer layer. The muscle rippled in response,
shifting and twisting as the crew hacked at the limbs with frantic, repeated strikes. Steel clanged against the ship's side.
Sparks flying as axes missed their mark and buried into the wood. The crew pushed forward, boots sliding on the brine-slicked planks, working in a desperate, synchronized rhythm to sever the hold the creature had on their vessel. Every swing was a fight for survival, the air thick with the smell of salt and raw, wounded sea life.
The fight for the rail was interrupted by a sudden, violent shift in the deck. A third tentacle,
thicker than any that had come before, erupted from the water behind the fighting men. It did not coil, it swung. The limb arched over the gunwale like a massive, wet whip, smashing through the heavy wooden railing as if it were dry kindling. Sailors caught in its path were sent sprawling, their harpoons flying from their hands and clattering uselessly across the deck. The sheer force of the blow shoved the entire line of men backward. They scrambled for footing, boots sliding over the slick, blood-stained planks as they retreated toward the mast. The tentacle retracted, sweeping across the open space and clearing the entire starboard side of the vessel in a single, devastating motion. The wood groaned under the pressure, the ship tilting sharply as the weight of the limb bore down. There was no room left to fight. The reach of the creature had turned the deck into a trap. Men scrambled up the rigging, gasping for air, their faces pale as they looked down at the empty space where their companions had stood only seconds before. The ship rocked violently, the rhythm of the battle broken by the sheer, overwhelming scale of the monster now claiming the deck as its own territory. The violent motion ceased, leaving the deck in a sudden, suffocating stillness. The ship groaned, shifting its weight as something massive rose from the dark depths directly against the hull. Water cascaded off a curved, obsidian surface, pouring back into the ocean with a sound like a retreating tide. Slowly, deliberately, the creature breached the surface. A beak, jagged and thick as a ship's timber, pushed above the waterline, dripping with thick brine. Then, the eye appeared. It was the size of a carriage wheel, a golden orb set into the wet, pulsating mass of the head. It did not blink, it did not shift. It simply stared upward, locking onto the men huddled near the mast with a cold, ancient intelligence that seemed to bypass sight and bore directly into their marrow. The sheer scale of it rendered the surrounding sea insignificant. The golden iris contracted, the pupil, a vertical slit that took in everything, the broken railings, the scattered weapons, the trembling men. It was a gaze of total, soul-crushing monstrosity. Time seemed to warp, stretching the seconds until every sailor felt the weight of that golden stare. The creature remained motionless, a titan of the abyss rising to claim the night, its presence turning the air heavy and freezing the breath in every throat. The golden eye remained fixed on the deck, a silent judge of the terror below. The two men trapped on the scaffold made no sound, their bodies rigid as the massive, rubbery limbs coiled around their midsections. There was no struggle, no frantic kicking against the inevitable. The creature moved with a terrifying, liquid grace. The limbs tightened, the wet suckers gripping the wood of the scaffold before pulling backward. In one fluid, seamless motion, the tentacles retracted. The men were dragged over the edge of the hull and into the black water without a single splash. The surface barely rippled as the weight vanished into the depths. The scaffold snapped, the timber splintering against the side of the ship as the limbs descended. Then, the eye submerged, the golden light fading into the murky dark of the ocean. The deck fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. No one moved. No one spoke. The crew stood paralyzed, their hands still gripping harpoons and axes, staring at the empty space where their shipmates had stood only moments before. The air felt thin, stripped of all momentum, leaving only the sound of the wind rattling through the rigging and the slow, rhythmic creak of the hull against the tide. The reality of the loss settled over the ship, a cold, heavy burden of silent, stunned grief. The sun broke over the horizon, turning the ocean into a flat, gray mirror. The violence of the night had vanished, replaced by a stillness that felt unnatural. On the deck of the Anchor, the damage was stark. Deep gouges marred the hull. The wood splintered where the limbs had gripped and torn. Scraps of rigging lay tangled in the debris, dripping with a thick, translucent slime that refused to wash away. Captain Dens walked the perimeter, his boots crunching on broken glass and discarded harpoons. He stopped near the bunkroom.
Inside, the man who had been dragged and rescued lay motionless. His skin was pale, his breathing shallow and erratic.
Throughout the night, he had drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling about golden light and endless cold.
Just as the morning light hit the porthole, his breath hitched, then stopped entirely. The crew gathered in the doorway, watching as the ship's doctor pulled a thin sheet over the man's face.
The sea was calm now, but the ship groaned under the weight of its own survival. Every timber felt fragile, every shadow in the corner of the deck a reminder of what had risen from the deep. The battle had ended, but the vessel was a shell, marked by the encounter in ways that wood and iron could never fully repair.
The Anchor limped toward Copenhagen, moving against the currents like a wounded beast.
Every creak of the mast sounded like a warning. The crew no longer looked at the horizon. They spent their watches staring at the floorboards,
their hands gripping the rails until their knuckles turned white. When the port of Copenhagen finally appeared through the fog, there was no cheering, no relief. They docked in silence, the ship's hull scarred by deep, jagged grooves that no carpenter could fully explain.
Captain Dens stood at the helm, his gaze fixed on the harbor, but he saw only the dark water of the African coast.
He watched the men disembark, each one walking with a hollow, measured gait. They were home.
Yet they remained trapped at sea. In the taverns and on the docks, they never spoke of the fight or the loss.
They only spoke of the eye. It appeared in their dreams, a massive golden sphere hovering in the black depths.
Unblinking and ancient. It was a memory that refused to fade.
A golden ghost that followed them onto dry land. The sea had let them go, but it had kept something vital in return.
Leaving the crew to drift through the rest of their lives in the shadow of that singular, terrifying stare.